Hello, dear viewers. Support me by subscribing to my channel and share my video if you like it. And also, make sure you comment your thoughts. Now let's start the video. There was a gently falling light snow. It was a constant flutter of thick, fluffy flakes obscuring the path for several hundred yards, blanketing the four riders in a white fog. Several inches of snow covered the ground, and the trees that surrounded them, the thick forest, were bare of their leaves, revealing nothing but brown sticks protruding from a never-ending expanse of white. Several branches groaned heavily under the weight of the snow on them, and every so often, the branches would lose their load. The heavy thump of snow, falling in chunks and hitting the ground, reached the riders. Otherwise, the silence of the forest was broken only by the noise of their horses' hooves crunching through the snow that mixed in with hard mud, the soft whumps of their breath and the creak of their riding leather as they shifted in their saddles. The four riders, 3 men and 1 woman, were dressed for the weather. They wore fur-lined cloaks over top of leather, chainmail, and thick woolen wear. Their boots were splattered with mud and laced up to mid-calf with thick soles. 2 of the men had beards, and there was a slight dusting of snow or frost caught in the dark whiskers. The woman's long, flyaway brown and silver hair also was laced with some frost. There was no one on the path other than them. Their target loomed closer and closer as they emerged from the forest. The snow-covered path they were on turned into a churned, hardened mud. Around them was a snow-covered field of rolling hills, with some patches of long grass, and bushes popping up through the snow sporadically. Many of those were tinged white or dotted with snow. Ahead, Winterfell, the home of the Starks and Wardens of the North, drew their eyes. The castle itself sat on top of a hill, overlooking not only the small wood they emerged from, but the large, dominating Wolf's Wood behind it to the north and west. The outer wall, a long gray border, was topped with snow like icing on a cake, and the many square and circular towers each presented a picturesque image of snow-capped mini-mountains. It would still take the riders several hours to meander from the small wooded forest to the castle, their bones settling in with the chilly air, but they knew that they would not be receiving a warm welcome. There were no Stark colors or banners flying over the towers and ramparts. Eventually, the 4 riders reached the massive gates, their slow ride up giving the men on the towers enough time to draw back their arrows and holler down, "Halt! Who goes?" One of the men, with pale hair and no beard, tilted his head up. His eyes coolly surveyed the men, and without speaking, one gulped. "Begging your pardon, Lord Bolton. We didn't see you there." Roose Bolton let his chin drop down in acknowledgement, and the massive doors slowly opened, creaking in the cold. Once they were fully pulled back, Bolton nudged his horse forward. The 3 others behind him did the same, and together they silently entered the first courtyard off the gate tower. The space opened up to a large courtyard, the hardened earth flattened by the many feet and grooved, where carts and animals walked. Despite being busy, an uneasy silence permeated the crowd that met the 4 riders. In front of them, on the low steps in front of the castle's main building, stood 2 people. A ragged, rowdy-looking young man with tousled black hair dotted with slowly melting snow stepped forward with a wide, manic grin. He was all in black, with a leather vest over a dark green woolen sweater. He spread his arms wide as he called a greeting to the riders. "Father, what brings you to Winterfell? Was it my raven? Did you hear the news?" At his side was a tall, slender woman with thin eyebrows and curly dark brown hair streaked with some silver gathered in a widow's bun atop her head. She stood silently, her hands clasped in front of her long black gown and matching black fur-trimmed cloak. Bolton gracefully climbed off his horse, his fellow companions copying him so that they stood side by side, watching carefully and looking around the Winterfell courtyard. "When did you send the raven, Ramsay? And to where?" "To the twins, of course," the man answered, surprise coloring his tone. "Did you not receive it?" He turned to the woman at his side, a challenge in his voice. "Lady Dustin, did they not receive it?" The woman, Lady Barbay Dustin, sniffed, cutting her eyes at the young man beside her, in all black. There was a scowl on her face as she replied, "And how would I know, Snow?" Rage overtook Ramsay's features for a moment. He struggled to contain the emotion, and it took several long moments of tense silence before he turned back to his father with a grin, although the bared teeth was more like a snarl. "Will you come in, father?" Bolton narrowed his eyes and strode forward, up the short steps and pushing ahead of his son as they entered the entrance hall that led into the Great Hall of Winterfell. Almost immediately, he stopped. The great hall was dark, with only the barest of candelabras lit that hung from above, and the wall sconces were dimmed, like the candle had burned long into the night and was at its last wick. There were some Bolton men, fellow bannermen, that Roose Bolton knew well, but many were of varying ages, with pockmarks or abrasions on their faces, and mean looks in their eyes as they warily stood to greet their leader's father. Bolton cast his eyes around the hall, not moving as his 3 other companions remained silent and formed a line behind him.
"Where's the Greyjoy?"
Ramsay, who had strode in confidently after his father, faltered only for a moment. Barbary Dustin followed, a silent ghost with light steps as she took up a place off to the side of Ramsay, out of direct line of sight of the 2 men. Ramsay continued walking and stood in front of the head table in the great hall, where the Starks traditionally sat during meals. "Oh, he's in the dungeons," said the young man, waving a hand airily. "As your prisoner." Bolton's voice remained even as he spoke. "The North has need for him as a political prisoner. It would be wise to give him a room, meal, and treatment, considering he is Balon Greyjoy's heir and remaining son." Ramsay's face twisted. "A room? That squid betrayed his Stark overlords. What good is it for me to give him something as a reward? He's far more entertaining this way." Bolton's eyes narrowed infinitesimally. "What did you do to him?" Pride shone in Ramsay's face. "I trained him. He was a slow learner, but he learned." "You flayed him," sighed Bolton. A small, tired sound. Ramsay shrugged unconcernedly, turning from facing them to reach for a drink from a goblet left on the table, peeled a few bits, removed a few others. "Again," stressed Bolton, his even tone dipping into frosty, "this is Balon Greyjoy's son and heir." Ramsay gave a startled, hysteria-tinged laugh, spilling a bit of the drink as he spun to face his father. "We've been flaying our enemies for 1,000 years. The flayed man is on our banners. Don't tell me time in the South softened your sensibilities, father." He sneered at the still silent men and women behind the Lord of the Dreadfort. "Or have these northern betrayers softened you?" There was steel in Bolton's voice as he rejoined, "My banners, not yours. You're not a Bolton, you're a Snow." Rage rippled across Ramsay's face. "And these men and lady, as you so carelessly say, are Lord John Umber, Lord Rickard Karstark, and Lady Meg Mormont." Stark supporters shock-colored Ramsay's voice, and his eyes narrowed suspiciously on them, just as his men stirred around and stood straight, or sat up from where they lounged. A few brave ones drew their swords from sheaths. Barbara stiffened, her back going straight and her frowning mouth pressing tightly down into a very thin line. "What are they doing here?" "Helping me," replied Bolton, gritting his teeth. "Greyjoy is a valuable hostage, not your plaything. I wanted to trade him for Moat Cailin for safe passage into the north from the south." Confusion filtered across Ramsay's face. "From the south? Father, I already asked." Lord Greyjoy refused. "Savages You sent terms to Balon Greyjoy without my consent," thundered Bolton, his thin, reedy voice rising for the first time in the conversation, enough that it startled his illegitimate son. "Why, you made me acting Lord of the Dreadfort," he stuttered, taking a small step back in the face of his father's fury. "I acted—" There was the making of a small snarl on Bolton's face. "I did not. I asked a simple task for you, which was to clear the northern lands of any Ironborn and to take revenge on the attack Theon Greyjoy made against Robb Stark. I needed Theon. I needed him whole." 2 bright splotches of red appeared on Ramsay's cheeks. "That Stark pup was our enemy. Theon was our enemy. But Reek will never betray us." "You're calling him Reek?" Bolton reached up to pinch his nose, breathing deeply and heavily through an exhale. "I place far too much trust in you." "Trust?" echoed Ramsay, regaining his confidence to take a step forward, his hands shaking at his side. "You sent a raven with instructions to clear Winterfell of the Ironborn with Dustin and Ryswell." "I did so! You wanted Theon Greyjoy. As a prisoner, I made it happen." His voice rose with each admission. "We received a raven with news that Tywin Lannister had something planned to kill Robb Stark, or at least severely wound him if rumors are true. When he reached the Freys at the Twins, all we had to do was hold Winterfell and the Boltons would be wardens of the North once more, the true kings of Winter, and I did." Bolton shut his eyes at the ringing confession. His son shouted out, "Oh, Ramsay," he sighed, "you utter, complete fool." No sooner than Bolton's voice finished did a cold breeze sweep the room and extinguish the two little flickering lights in the great hall. "What?" Ramsay stuttered out. In the darkness, there was the sound of the men, Ramsays drawing their swords and standing in the uneasy silence for a few tense heartbeats. And then, what the? A shining whip of blue flame erupted in the dark. It highlighted the pale, horrified face of one of Ramsay's men, just as it caught him, cutting through him horizontally and splitting him in two. Just as quickly, the flame disappeared. There was a quick sequence of multiple pops, loud cracks followed by several screams, timed very suspiciously to bright red jets of light that appeared from different parts of the room. A gurgle near Ramsay was accompanied by the wet rasp of blood clogging someone's throat as they tried to breathe. And silence. With the same cold breeze, light returned to the great hall, but this time all the candles were lit. The hall burst into bright, warm light that was antithetical to the scene before the four riders. The men who had drawn their swords lay scattered where they stood. A few were ripped in two without a rob of blood, as their wounds had cauterized from the bright, flaming whip. Others had their throats slashed, but the cut was cleaner than any blade, and the last man had a giant icicle pushing up through his chest, having burst from the floor. That man was hanging limply over the slowly melting ice, the water mixing with the dark red of his blood. Lady Barbary was trembling, eyes wide and her mouth open in a silent scream. The very voice was stolen from her as she yanked and frantically pulled on the heavy frozen fabrics of skirts where ice encased her up to her knees. Holding her in her spot by the head table, she kept darting her eyes around the room, from the dead, bloodied bodies to Ramsay. Ramsay, however, was entire frozen except for his head, ice hanging off him and thick. His eyes darted back and forth frantically as he took stock of his men in the room. Those Bolton men who had not drawn their swords stood just as frozen, but that was by pure terror. Standing in front of him was a young woman with bright amber eyes and thick curly brown hair, half pulled back, and the rest cascading down her back. She wore a strange outfit, a black overcoat with long sleeves and an open V-neck that revealed a shiny and tight gray undershirt. The coat itself was unique that it split open at the front of the woman's waist, encircled by a wide belt. The coat was trimmed with gray fur, wolf fur. Underneath the coat, she had tight black trousers like a man and matching black boots that ended at her knees. She had a wooden stick in the palm of one hand, and Ramsay knew instantly who she was. That, and her expression, sent chills down Ramsay's spine. "Double witch," he stuttered from the cold. And not fear, his mind stubbornly whispered. His lips were beginning to tinge blue. "Ramsay Snow," the woman began, her voice cool. Familiar rage suffused the man, and it warmed his chilled blood, but only just irrational hate overrode any potential of common sense. "Tell me, witch, how fares Robb Stark? Where is the Wolf King now?" Something flickered in her expression, and she raised her wand. A wordless spell burst from it, sailing through the air and hitting Ramsay's right arm, covered in ice. It shattered, splitting off into tiny specks of snow dust. The temperature from the ice froze Ramsay's limb to the point that shattering also removed it, leaving the wound frozen shut, preventing blood loss.
"Ramsay howled! You cut off my arm! You tore it off! You did this!"
"You betrayed Robb." He looked up, tears in his eyes as he tried to process the cool voice. Then he snarled, "I would do it again, you bit." Another spell, and his other arm encased in ice shattered. Ramsay began cursing, screaming, spittle flying from his mouth. "I have 2 more limbs to go. It would be best if you answered my questions," said the witch. Barbary, also encased, had tears streaming down her pale cheeks, and although no one could hear her, she was hiccuping, gasping for air, and on the verge of a panic attack as she watched the witch coolly dismember Ramsay Snow in Winterfell's great hall, while the man's father stood by and watched. "Lord Karstark, Lord Umber," directed Bolton quietly without turning his eyes from the spectacle in front of him. "Please bar the doors from anyone entering." The 2 men silently did as told, turning on their boots and moving to the door, which had already been shut after Ramsay entered it to keep the cold out. However, they dropped a heavy wooden beam to secure the room. Its dull thud resonated and shook Ramsay, like it was the sound of his judge, jury, and executioner, signaling their position and readying for his end. What do you want to know?" he snapped through his pain, pale eyes staring her down. "Why did you take Tywin Lannister's offer?" Ramsay snarled. Why not? The Boltons used to be kings. We could have been kings again. He directed the last part at his father, behind the witch. Bolton stepped forward until he was just an arm's length behind her at her right. The curly-haired witch turned her head towards her shoulder, slightly, although her eyes never left the man encased in ice. She spoke directly to the young black-haired bastard. Who else was involved in the conspiracy? You Lady Dustin. Barbry's already pale-faced went snow-white, and she swayed in her spot. Who else? When Ramsay just stared molishly at her, she raised her wand again and cast the same spell, this time hitting his left leg. Ramsay's scream rang from the rafters, his entire body's weight balanced on his remaining limb and precariously teetering. He remained upright only due to the stiff, thick ice. "Father," cried Ramsay, tears on his face, as well as snot. "Father, please." "Ramsay," said the man quietly. "Who else?" "I don't know." Ramsay: "I don't know. I don't. By the old gods, I don't." The witch sighed. "I have one more leg, but I don't fancy the idea of shattering his chest to pieces once that fails." At the threat, Ramsay's wet breath shuddered. She raised her wand once more, and Ramsay blurted, "The Freys, Restwell, Vaprin, Glover, Dustin. We were all given orders, ravens from King's Landing, from the Old Lion." The young woman lowered her wand slowly until the tip pointed at the floor. Ramsay let out a heavy sigh of relief. It's nearly over, he thought. I'm safe. Is that all? Asked his father, coolly. Ramsay nodded, bobbing his head quickly. Yes, that's all, I swear. Bolton paused for a moment and then dipped his head. Very well. He turned from his son, removing his eyes from him for the first time since they entered the room. He faced the black-dressed witch and said, quietly, As you will it, my lady. Father, what? But Ramsay never learned why his father turned from him. Why he turned to look at the strange magical woman who raised her wand one last time and said in a fury-tinged voice, Reducto. Hermione burnt the remains of the dead while Barbary, nearly catatonic in shock, watched. The stench was growing familiar. But a blast of wind swept it away, out the now open doors. Although some acrid smell lingered, the great hall in Winterfell was free, liberated once more from those who didn't want it preserved for the Starks. She stood under one large candelabra, interlocking silver and pewter chains, looking around the large hall, slightly lost, now that she disposed of Ramsay, one of the collaborators who orchestrated the attack at the twins. Bolton moved to her side, watching her carefully. Hermione sighed. I'm sorry about your son. Demeric was my son. Ramsay killed him. Hermione turned to face the older man. His face remained stoic, but in the tightness next to his eyes and the dull color to them, she read his pain. I'm still sorry! He inclined his head, hands clasped behind his back. Machen Karstark walked up to them. Umber, barely a step behind, he was shaking snow from his shoulders and hair. I sealed the main gates, the large man announced, made those inside the courtyard skittish as a new foal, but I figure you can go out and deal with them later, eh, Bolton? The man nodded shortly. Great, John sighed, a deep and loud sound that all felt deep in their bones. He cast his gaze around the hall, looking at it with dismayed eyes. He was supposed to be here for this. The mood took a further plunge. Hermione turned her face away and rolled her bottom lip into her mouth, biting down hard on it to stop it from trembling. She squeezed her eyes shut and focused on taking a deep breath. Robb is a strong king, she told herself. You can be strong in his place for his people. Until he's back. Do what he would have wanted done. Turning back to face the others, Hermione cleared her throat. Right, well, let's move on, shall we? Lord Bolton, if you and Lord Umber could gather those remaining, and I suppose see if they are more Ramsay's men than yours. The two men nodded and left.
Lady Mormont.
Lord Karstark. Hermione turned to the two others. The latter stood a bit straighter at being spoken to. Let's gather the servants and see if we can get some guest rooms and a meal. Something simple prepared. Then, if all goes well, we'll start portkeying people over and give the clear for the army to move to Winterfell. Smeja nodded. Yes, she said, quirking her thin lips. Winter is coming, as the Starks like to say. She then took off in a direction which Hermione assumed meant she knew where she was going. At once, Lady Hermione, said Karstark, his voice firm. He dipped his head as he left and spun on his heel in another direction, leaving Hermione alone in the great hall. Winter is coming, my arse. thought Hermione, moodily meandering down the large center aisle that separated several long wooden tables. The Great Hall was similar to Hogwarts Hall layout. There were 4 long tables vertically parallel to one another, but 2 on each side of the room, separated by the center aisle. The Starks used no dais like others, but rather a long head table like Hogwarts. However, the main difference was that at the end of the hall, there were 4 horizontal, smaller rows of tables. Those tables were shrouded partially in darkness due to their somewhat removed location far from the chandeliers and wall sconces. While there was no enchanted ceiling above her or floating candles that dripped wax or owls delivering mail in the morning, the Winterfell Great Hall felt like home. Tension began to lift from Hermione's shoulders, and she let her hand trail down the smooth wood until she reached the head table. She gazed upon it, picking out the main 2 seats where Eddard and Catelyn Stark would sit. "Were you on your father's right, Robb?" she wondered, her eyes lingering on the empty chair. "There's so much I don't know about you right now. Things I wish I did. I wish you were here." "Lady Hermione?"
Hermione turned at the call, plastering a pleasant, placid look on her face. "Lord Karstark?"
"We're ready to begin the process of moving the injured to Winterfell's courtyard. I believe a few of the other lords wish to speak to you about the coming winter and plans to secure the castle," he continued. Hermione sighed, leaving one last longing look at the table. She then strode down the aisle towards the man. "Very well. I suppose we can safely say that winter is here." "Indeed, my lady." "And where's Theon Greyjoy?" she asked, reaching Karstark's side. A ripple of disgust spread across Karstark's face. "Dungeons. He's refusing to come out." Hermione stopped and blinked up at him. "I beg your pardon?" Karstark looked like he very much wanted to shift uncomfortably, but instead, his mouth turned down into a scowl. "We tried to have some of the Bolton guards pry him out, but he began to scream bloody murder. They dropped him, and he retreated to the darkest corner of his cell." Hermione's eyebrows pinched. "I see." She shook her head slightly. "Who else is here?" Thrown by her change in topic, Karstark fumbled for a moment, and then sputtered out Mallister and Serwyn. And of course, he sighed, Bracken and Blackwood. They wouldn't stay away in the courtyard. Karstark nodded, and Hermione began walking back the way they came in. Karstark on her heels. It's the largest area within Winterfell. Even though they porkied in and walked from outside the gates, calling loudly to be let in, they just decided not to wait. Hermione tossed a small grin at Karstark. "Can you blame them or anyone else? We've been planning this for weeks now. And that broken tower could barely suffice to keep any of us warm and healthy as the snow came in." Karstark sighed. "Yes, but..." Out in the courtyard, the 4 men whom Karstark named stood in a row, although they were facing different directions. Bracken and Blackwood were looking towards Hermione when she exited the Great Hall, but Serwyn was barking orders to the small collection of guards he brought along with him. As having visited Winterfell before, and being a nearby lord, he knew the area, whereas Mallister stood calmly, with his hands clasped behind his back, as he coolly surveyed the gently fluttering Bolton banners hanging off the ramparts. Bracken spoke first, loudly, drawing their attention. "Lady Hermione..." Hermione, pleased to see a friendly face, smiled. "Lord Bracken." She turned to the others. "Lord Blackwood, Lord Mallister, Lord Serwyn, welcome to Winterfell. As you can see, Lady Mormont and Lords Bolton, Umber, and Karstark were successful." "Excellent news, my lady," greeted Clay Serwyn, his riotous black curls bobbing as he inclined his head to her in respect. "Should we send a message back to the others to arrive?" Hermione turned to Karstark. "It's your decision, Lord Karstark. Is Winterfell habitable for what remains of our army?" He nodded slowly and thoughtfully, his gaze turned inward. "Yes, I believe so. There might be some changes we need to address as they occur, but we can start moving people into Winterfell." Turning back to Serwyn, Hermione said, "Can I borrow some of your men, Lord Serwyn?" The man's narrow face lengthened as he frowned. "Of course. But why?" "Theon Greyjoy's in the dungeons, and the Bolton men can't get him out without him being scared of them," she replied shortly. Understanding dawned on his face, and shortly thereafter, Karstark was leading Hermione to the dungeons with 4 Serwyn men-at-arms behind her. The lower they went, the damper the air became, and the outside autumn chill that teased of a bitter winter began to make itself known, far underground. The very breath from their lungs turned frosty with each step they took down long, winding stairs until they opened to the dungeons proper, jail cells on either side. One cell had several slobbering, snarling dogs with matted fur barking loudly at them as they strode past. Their eyes were wild and their muzzles bloody, and Hermione's stomach turned at the thought of what Ramsay kept him for. Other cells were occupied with shivering, huddled figures in torn and dirty clothes, the scent of unwashed bodies, urine, and others had Hermione wandlessly and non-verbally casting a bubblehead charm, filtering out the smells for fresh air. There seemed to be some spell, not a real one, but a presence, meant to keep people from talking, as the small group kept silent until they reached another cell, where a single Bolton guard was staring into its depths with a scowl on his hardened face. "He still hasn't moved?" asked Karstark as they approached, his voice modulated to keep slightly hushed. The Bolton guard shook his head. "He stopped whimpering and crying now, milord, but if I take a step into the cell, it starts up again." Hermione peered into the gloom, trying to spot Theon Greyjoy. What did he look like? Was he another Draco Malfoy, tall and arrogant, with a pointy chin and smirk on his lips as he watched his chaos? Was he at all bitter at what he did, how he betrayed Robb? Or, according to the guards, was he a shell of a man who was once that way? In the meantime, Karstark had dismissed a very relieved Bolton guard, who quickly disappeared back up the dungeon steps. Curiosity overtook Hermione, and she stepped up to the door of the cell. Its metal gate swung open inwards, scattered hay on the floor, mixed with brown spots of mouse droppings, and Hermione nudged at some of it with the toe of her boot. "Lights, men," she requested, and two Sarwyn guards grabbed nearby torches from the wall sconces and held them up in a loft. The light spilled into the cell, and then, eventually, Hermione spied the huddled figure in the far corner, curled protectively around itself. The light hit on scuffed brown boots, stained trousers, and what was once a green shirt but was now torn and bloody, as well as loose on the man's frame. Hermione stepped forward, one Sarwyn guard following just a step behind, so that the torch lit on the man's face. His eyes were squeezed tightly shut. His golden brown hair was greasy and lank, and there was a beard a shade darker than his hair, covering his chin and cheeks. There was gauntness to his face, sickly pale, which Hermione did not like.
"Theon?" she asked.
The man whimpered and curled tighter. Hermione inched forward, and when the guard attempted to, she waved him off without moving her eyes from the Greyjoy air. "Theon, Ramsay is dead. You have nothing to fear from him anymore." There was a shuffle behind her, and Hermione could picture in her mind Karstark's silent scoff and eye roll. The North would likely want retribution, but Hermione wanted answers first. At Ramsay's name, Theon shuddered violently. He began mumbling something under his breath. "Theon?" "No, no, you can't trick me," he muttered, his voice high-pitched and coming out quick. "I'm Reek, Reek!" Hermione frowned. "Reek?" she mouthed in confusion. "Trick you? Trick you how?" But Theon reached up and grabbed fistfuls of his hair, clutching at it and shaking his head back and forth. "No, tell him you couldn't trick me." "My lady," began one of the guards, tentatively. "Is he even all there in the head?" "By the gods," muttered another. "What did the Bolton bastard do?" Hermione ran her eyes over what she could see of Theon's body, and while he was whole, despite what Ramsay implied, it was clear he had been scarred in others' way. A cold wave washed over Hermione, and she was vividly reminded of her own torture at Bellatrix's wand. The woman scarred her eventually, but the phantom pain of the Cruciatus didn't leave physical marks, and the young witch wondered if Ramsay had been clever enough to do something similar. Theon was still muttering, rocking slightly, when Hermione withdrew her wand and snapped out a soft stupefy. He blissfully fell silent, but his frame remained tense even when unconscious. "Let's get him to a bedroom and keep him under constant watch," said Hermione, turning to the two guards, not holding the torches. "It's entirely possible he could be suicidal, and I want him kept alive. The spell will last more than long enough for you to bring him upstairs safely." The two Sarwyn guards nodded their understanding and shuffled into the cell, lifting Theon between them, and then quickly disappeared, following her orders. "You plan to keep him alive?" asked Karstark quietly, as the guards holding the torches returned them to their sconces. Hermione nodded, that cold wave burning through her. One, to learn what happened when he sacked Winterfell, and then to learn why he betrayed Robb. Karstark nodded in satisfaction, although Hermione knew he was eager for more justice. She was the last out of the cell. Karstark faced forward, looking towards any perceived danger, coming down their only route back up to the main levels of Winterfell. He was ready to fall into step alongside, or as he and the other lords had been doing lately, just behind her as she emerged from the cell. As they walked past the brain dogs, Hermione turned to Stark and said calmly, "Although every bit furious and hiding it, we should also have someone come down here and deal with those as well." "Yes, my lady." Neither looked back, but if they had, they would have noticed the dogs' whimpers and them falling silent and have seen the creeping frost and ice that built up in Theon's old cell. They would have seen the trail of glittering ice that followed them to the stairs, only to quickly turn to water, leaving nothing but wet spots on an already damp stone floor. 3 months earlier, Robb's eyes fluttered as he came to, a slight moan escaping his lips. His body felt sore, but he wasn't dead, so that was a positive. His eyes opened, and he took in the bright light and airy space. His hand lying at his side, smoothed over incredibly soft fabric. He was on a small bed with a strange metal frame. There were white curtains around him, but not from a poster bed. They were just fabric dividers between himself and, as he turned his head, to the empty bed next to him. There were 4 other beds to his right, reaching the end of the room. There, a large open window gave a tantalizing glimpse of beyond. The sun was shining, there was a mountain range in the distance, and he could see the gently shifting leaves of trees in full summer bloom. The air that wafted in from outside was warm and sweet, and there were calls of birds chirping and singing. Outside the ward he was in, it was the throes of summer, but when he was at the Twins for the summit, reports of snowfall in the north had trickled in from the White Harbor. Had he lost that much time? Robb turned his head to the left this time and nearly startled himself off the bed. A young, lean man with messy black hair was slumped in a chair at his table's side, his chin touching his chest as soft snores escaped him every so often. His arms were crossed, and his legs were straight in front of him, one ankle resting on the other. His clothes were the oddest, Robb decided, eyeing him warily. He had blood-red overrobes, which were open and pooling on the floor, but underneath he wore a nicely pressed black tunic of some sort, with buttons running up the middle, tucked into his trousers, which were similar to Lady Hermione's jeans. "Poppy, Madame Pomfrey!" A voice across from Robb called loudly, and the man snorted and then was immediately out of his seat. Emerald eyes wide behind, strangle circular frames, and a wand in his hand as he scanned for danger. The man is awake, as is Ora Potter. The man, Ora Potter, turned to Robb, who remained on the bed, warily eyeing him back. There was something familiar about the man, something that had Robb thinking he had seen him before or heard his name before, but as far as he knew, there were no Potters in the north or the Riverlands. Robb turned back to the male voice that called for the Maester. And Robb's eyes went wide as he realized the call came from a large portrait of a man in a lime green robe next to a cauldron. Ora Potter's eyes followed his, and he stifled a laugh. "Yeah, the portraits move," he said with a soft sigh. He ran a hand through his messy hair, making it worse. Just as a woman in white robes over a strangely scandalous white dress that ended at her knees appeared behind one of the cloth partitions. She was much older, with a shock of white, curly hair pulled neatly back from her face. She too was carrying a wand. "Mr. Potter," she admonished, "you were to call me when our patient awoke." "He was asleep," helpfully called the man in the portrait, causing the woman to glare at the man. Potter looked sheepish and dipped his head, grinning up at the woman, Madame Pomfrey, who sighed loudly. "Trouble you are," she said. Although fondly, she turned back to Robb, waving her wand over him. Having spent time with Hermione, he didn't move, but he did tense slightly. Potter noticed this. "Been around magic, have you?" he questioned, eyes narrowing. "You carry wands," said Robb unnecessarily, "like Lady Hermione." The man tensed, and Madame Pomfrey stopped waving her wand over his body. Robb swallowed. "Lady Hermione?" repeated Potter, a steely note in his voice. Robb nodded, slowly. He looked around, taking in the high ceilings but the moving portraits, the wands in Potter and Pomfrey's hands, the strange thrum in the air, and finished. "This is Hogwarts, is it not?" Potter and Pomfrey shared a glance. Potter then said, "It is. How do you know that?" "Lady Hermione told me about it," said Robb cautiously. The memories coming to him quickly now. Ora Potter was Harry Potter, one of Hermione's best friends. "And where is Lady Hermione now?" snapped Potter, leaning forward over the bed to lean close to Robb's face. "What have you done with her?" Where is she? If you've heard her. Mr. Potter, snapped Pomfrey, physically shoving him back from the bed. If you wouldn't mind saving your inquisition of my patient until after I make sure he's healed from that rather horrid stab wound. Healed? Asked Robb, glancing down at his stomach. The woman sniffed. Yes. Utterly barbaric muggle weapons. Hagrid, our groundskeeper found you and brought you to us right away. I was able to stop the bleeding and patch you up easily, although you might need a good day or so before your muscles don't seize. You'll be a bit sore anyway. Potter at the side had his arms crossed and scowled deeply. Are you done, Madam Pomfrey? The woman whirled on him and scolded, Don't you take that tone with me, Harry Potter. I've seen you in here more often than I liked over the years, and while I always healed you up, I won't hesitate to stick you in one of these beds either. Cowed, the man mumbled a contrite sorry as Robb said, slowly, Harry Potter, Hermione's best friend. As Pomfrey left, muttering under her breath, Potter turned to face Robb and nodded. His tone was still distrustful, and there was anger, but he seemed to be controlling himself when he asked, Yeah, who are you? Robb shifted, not wanting to have this conversation flat on his back. There was a twinge of discomfort around his middle, but nothing that suggested he was bleeding out or nearly died. Robb Stark, he said, debating to add King in the North, but ultimately deciding against it. And how do you know Hermione? She's... Robb bit off the sentence. What could he say? Hermione was... What? His friend. Certainly. His witch. Undoubtedly. She had done more for him and his cause than an entire army. But she was more than that, else he wouldn't have had Torrhen assigned as her personal guard. She was someone precious to him. He wanted more than friendship from her, without a doubt, and he was currently looking for a way out of the Frey alliance his mother had brokered, although he thought darkly with them breaking guest rights at the summit, I am definitely free of them for good. She's what? Asked an increasingly frustrated Harry Potter. She's just her, he finished lamely. My friend, I suppose. Harry sighed and collapsed into the chair he was in previously, and Robb winced at the graceless move. At the slouch the man presented, Maester Luwin and his father would have had his hide for it. Harry had his head in his hands, breathing heavily. Robb saw a faint tremor in the man's shoulders, as though he was struggling to control his emotions. Where is she? Asked Harry, finally, quietly. Most likely with the rest of the army, answered Robb, just as quietly, causing Harry's head to snap up. In the Wolfswood, if the portkey worked properly. At Harry's look, he elaborated. We all had the same portkey. The fact that I am not where I should be makes me hesitant that she's where she should be. Where's this Wolfswood? Asked Harry. Somewhere here in Britain. Britain? Echoed Robb. No. Lady Hermione mentioned she was from a different universe. Harry swore under his breath and mumbled something uncomplimentary about a man named Dumbledore. He turned his emerald eyes on Robb and asked sternly, But how did you get here? I'm not sure, said Robb. How did Hermione get to your world? Pressed Harry, his voice hard. Robb shook his head. I'm not sure. The man growled, standing and pacing the small space between Robb's bed and the curtain. How long has she been in your world? About a year, answered Robb warily, watching the man pace, and the edge of his robe snap sharply at his turns. Is she safe? Is she okay? Bit out Harry. You mentioned an army? Yours, I take it? Has she been fighting? Was she hurt? Lady Hermione is as safe as she can be, replied Robb, miffed at the idea of him not taking care of the woman he felt deeply for. And while she has been in a few battles, her magic protects her, and when it cannot, the guard I assigned her, my friend and loyal subject, does the rest. She spent most of her time in the library at Riverrun searching for a way back here, or, with me, counseling me and my men. A stricken look spread over Harry's face as he stared at Robb. Then how do we get her back? Robb turned his face from Harry, feeling a sharp pang in his chest as he softly said, I don't know, just as he wondered, how do I get back? Out of a collective Northern and Riverlands army that totaled 25,000 men, 8,000 of those remained behind at Riverrun as a reserve. 5,000 had been split from the original host further north through the Neck to bypass the Twins, and 6,500 of those that remained of the original army number had perished at the Twins in the surprise attack between the Freys, the Glovers, the Dustins, the Viprens, and the Mountains men, all thanks to the careful planning of the Freys and Lannisters and poor timing. Barely 5,500 men remained. A quarter of those were injured, and no one was sure if they'd be battle-ready ever again. Of the 4,000 that remained from that, most were mere handfuls under missing commanders, such as Wendell Manderly, or they were lords with less than a handful of men, like Clay Serwyn, who wandered around with a vacant look on his bloody face. On top of it, both Catelyn Stark and Robb Stark were missing. Along with them, the small John Umber, Wendell Manderly, Blackwood's son, Lucas, and Patrick Mallister, all representatives of their houses, were missing as well. The other member of the Kingsguard, Dacey, was unaccounted for, and Oliver Frey, Robb's squire, had been tied up and guarded day and night by virtue of being a Frey. And in the midst of it all, Hermione sat around her dining table in her tent, liberated from her precious beaded bag, staring vacantly at the map of Westeros she and Robb used to keep track of his family. Her eyes were on the remaining splotches. Arya was at River Run, luckily under Betcher and Brienne's watchful eyes. Sansa was still in King's Landing, and Bran was north of the Wall, moving westward for some strange reason. Rickon's dot remained at Skagos. The dot of blood that represented Robb Stark was unmoving at the Twins, a burned black mark, not dead, as the blood would have disappeared, unable to be found on a map of Westeros. Eddard stood behind her, a silent sentry continuing his brother's work, while his father, Lord Karstark, shouted himself blue in the face at the Great John. She had luckily cast Muffley before the men began ripping into each other, talking over one another while Rose Bolton quietly tried to interject some words, but was ignored. The remaining men who hovered outside around her green canvas tent didn't need to know just how desperate and broken their leaders were. "What are we gonna do now, huh?" the Great John roared. "We need the king." "That's what I've been telling you," roared back Karstark. "We can send out search parties for him." "Where?" "Back to the Freys. Those murderous bastards?" spat Great John, turning and stabbing a pointed finger at Roose when he spoke next. "Or perhaps east, towards Winterfell, which was taken by that one's bastard?" "I did not tell him to do that," growled the pale man. Great John rolled his eyes. "Oh, he and Lady Barbary Dustin thought it up themselves, did they? Let's take Winterfell," they thought. After all, it's no secret in the north that the Boltons have wanted Winterfell ever since they were cut down by the Stark kings of old. "You can accuse Lord Bolton all you want, Umber, but know that I too could just as easily fit that being a cadet branch of the Stark family," snarled Karstark, "and yet I have done nothing but show my loyalty to King Robb, as has Bolton." "Well, that's just what you were planning with the man then," snarled Great John Umber, eyes flashing and his face red. "Did you continue to slip information to Glover with those extra parchments you wanted and were given?" "How dare you?" hissed Karstark, vibrating in his anger. The flap to the tent opened, and Lord Tytos Blackwood and Lord Jonos Bracken walked in, still in their bloodied armor, 3 days later, both with weary looks upon their faces. "Are they still at it?" asked Blackwood, reaching for the free chair next to Hermione and sitting heavily in it. Bracken took the seat next to him, which was also next to Bolton. The pale man with thinning hair sighed. "Unfortunately, they won't listen to anything anyone says." "And what about Lady Hermione?" shouted Great John. "It was her magic that we relied on. It could just as easily be her fault." "Hey, now," shouted Bracken, leaping to his feet, just as Eddard had his sword out and pointed at Umber before the man's words ended, his voice ringing in the silence in the tent. Hermione, finally, looked up from the map to stare at the large giant of a man with deadened eyes. "It's entirely possible," she said tonelessly, "that I messed something up in the spell, but it wouldn't make sense that only one was off from an entire bunch, especially as Robb and I took the trip several times to make sure the space was large enough for everyone." With that, the bluster left Umber, and he collapsed into the chair closest to him, Karstark still tense and preferring to stand. "Then where is he?" muttered Umber. "He's alive," said Hermione, eyes slipping back to the map. "At Robb's dot. We know that much, but according to this, he's not in Westeros." Could he, started Bracken tentatively, "could he be where you come from, Lady Hermione?" Hermione frowned. I suppose. What good does knowing where King Robb is?" groused Blackwood, leaning back in his chair. "Doesn't help us now. Without him, the army is leaderless unless we send parties out to bring back Bran or Rickon, and even then, they're too young to lead." "Robb's will dictated that if he were indisposed, Arya would be the next leader," said Hermione, turning to the man at her other side. "Princess Arya?" asked Blackwood, disbelief in his voice, but at Hermione's glower, he hastily backtracked. "Well, I suppose she's vicious enough and quite proficient with a sword." Hermione sighed. "She's still quite young. Robb wanted several of us to help her fall into a leadership role. But she's not Robb, she finished the thought mentally. The rest seemed to have heard the thought because many slouched or slumped in their seats. There was a heaviness in the air as those around the dining table began to realize just what they lost with Robb's disappearance. Hermione shivered as the air around her significantly cooled and chilled. "Can we even keep the Northern Army together?" whispered Stark through bloodless lips. "Not without the king," rumbled Umber, bowing his head into his hands on the table. "Merlin, what are we going to do?" she thought, bringing a hand up to bite her nail. Behind her, Stark began pacing the length of the living and dining area. We moved back towards the twins because Robb wanted to return to the north and retake Winterfell. He had made his point about the Lannisters, but had other priorities. The north is a priority. We need to re-establish the chain of command. Her eyes darted to the bundle of letters Robb had left in her tent, the communications between him and his half-brother Jon, the new commander of the Night's Watch, and make sure that they get the help they need. If what Jon wrote is true— "We have him," said Hermione suddenly, coming to a decision. "I beg your pardon," stuttered Stark, turning to face her. "How?" Hermione looked up. "A few options. Polyjuice potion, which, using a piece of hair from Robb from his comb, I know it's still at Riverrun, we can use it and someone can pretend to be Robb for an hour. Alternatively, I can cast a glamour on someone, but I'd have to be there to reapply it every so often. A glamour lasts longer than Polyjuice, though." She trailed off, a thoughtful look on her face, leaning back in her chair. "Or we can say he was badly wounded in the escape, and it will give us a few months' time to avoid showing his face in public. Then we can use Polyjuice or a glamour." Glancing around the table and at their stupefied faces, Hermione said, testily, "It buys us time." "Time for what?" asked Bolton, eyes dark as he stared at her. "Until we can get Robb back," said Hermione firmly, looking at each of the men in the eye. "As long as we keep morale up, as long as we maintain his ideals, we can manage. We have Arya, yes, she's young and untrained, but we can help her. We can all take turns being around her and teaching her. She ought to know this anyway." "And what of those who seek to harm us?" asked the great Jon lowly. "Once they know that King Robb is missing." "Well, he won't be then," retorted Hermione sharply, glaring up at him. "We'll use Polyjuice then, where he can lead men in battle. The rest of the time will contain the information that he is missing." "How?" asked Stark, his lips trembling. Hermione's brain raced as she pondered ideas. A jinx on the men, or a taboo like what Voldemort had in place whenever someone said his name during the war. I can cast it. It'll stop anyone from speaking of Robb's disappearance, especially if it's keyed into that thought. The despair around the room was lifting. It was not entirely gone. Many of them were still feeling the loss of many of the Northern and Riverland Army, but they weren't in as a dire situation than they were. The chill that had come over the room earlier was lifting as well, and the crackle of the flame in the fireplace seemed to grow louder, more comforting in response. "This," began Bolton slowly, "could work. It just might." "But who will be in charge?" asked Bracken, glancing around. Although His Grace's will was clear about who would help Princess Arya, every minor or hedgelord, as well as great houses, will be vying for the position as King's Regent. In this case, a princess's regent. We'd all have to watch our backs. "No one person should be in charge," said Hermione firmly, looking around the room and meeting everyone's eyes. "That wouldn't be fair, and someone could easily usurp Robb's position." Stark looked around. "Maybe a great council." "What?" asked Hermione. While Hermione was confused by the name, the others in the room had various looks of disbelief. Bolton and Eddard, outright hostility, the great Jon, or confusion, Bracken and Blackwood. Stark nervously cleared his throat, eyes darting around the room. A great council. In the early days of the North, before even the kings of winter, there were numerous families that were monarchical. Those who formed alliances created a great council, each with a representative for a seat. A single high king was chosen as a final deciding vote. Once the kings of winter emerged and subjugated the families, they initially kept the great council, giving those loyal to them a voice. Those were the first great houses. Hermione frowned. "This sounds familiar." The great Jon scoffed, his arms crossed. His beard nearly vibrated with the intensity of his tense jaw underneath the hair as he grit out, "The great council is a sack of piss. Idea Stark. The original great council had barely 6 or 7 men on it. Along with the High King, we've over 100 lords." Are they all going to get a say? Well, I don't know, no. I thought, sputtered Karstark, looking at Umber and then around the table, particularly at Bolton, whose look of shock had turned into quiet calculation, hoping the man would aid him. What's next? Grumbled the Great John, sarcasm in his voice. Would we all sit at a round table and pledge ourselves to an empty throne? How would we decide what the council would promote in laws or rule? A round table, Hermione thought, latching onto the words as a hysterical laugh bubbled up her throat. She clamped her mouth shut in a long, thin line as she struggled to contain her mirth. But something slipped out, and as Bracken looked at her, eyes wide, Hermione could no longer keep quiet. She laughed until her ribs ached, tears streaming down her face. She leaned back in her chair, imagining the great on Umber in the white tunic of the Holy Grail Knights and bucket-head chainmail, and worse, someone like Bolton following him with a pair of coconuts. Has she lost her mind? Muttered someone at the table as she struggled to remove images of Monty Python's Holy Grail film from her mind. Leaning over the table slightly, Hermione sucked in deep breaths and then used the palm of her hands to wipe at her tear-stained cheeks. I think, she croaked out before trying again, her voice only wobbling a little. I think that's a great idea. You do? Asked Umber, blinking in shock. Hermione nodded, and the more she thought about it, the more she warmed to the idea. Yes, a great council of the lords and ladies of the North and the Riverlands joined, working together for the betterment of their lands. The North has strict beliefs towards things, does it not? Bolton, Karstark, and Umber shared looks, and then Karstark was slowly nodding. Ah, yes. I suppose there are rules that we all intrinsically follow. Those who follow the faith of the Seven have knights and knighthoods, interrupted Blackwood curiously, with vows of honor and pledges of allegiance to a lord. Hermione's lips twitched. Commit no treason, give mercy unto him who asks. Do not take up battles and wrongful quarrels for love or worldly goods. Blackwood eyed Hermione shrewdly. Yes, quite. The North does that without such vows, interjected Karstark, with a nasty look to Blackwood for his interruption. But how do you know these, Lady Hermione? We have stories of great knights and round tables, too, she said, lips twitching at the popular myth of her homeworld country, who followed and believed in a code of chivalry and honor. What happened to these knights? Asked Bracken curiously, leaning towards her over the table. Hermione turned her eyes to him and said quietly, They were just stories. They never existed, not until I came here. Anyway. There was a compliment in her words, soft-spoken as they were, that made the men around her table straighten. A great council, then, sighed Bolton. The first in millennia. With a representative from each house, agreed Karstark, the best from each one. Or all who are left, morosely added Bracken with a sigh. Organizing this with who remains here at the tower in the Wolfswood is going to be a mess. It can wait, now that we know what we're doing, said Hermione, sitting straight in her seat as plans came together. Instead, let's talk about needs to be done next. Retaking Winterfell, like Robb had planned. A great council can convene when we're there, and have the available space. We need more people to retake Winterfell, argued Umber, finally back to a conversation topic he could participate in and enjoy. We have too many wounded, the tower is in desperate need of repairs, and it's likely that men will end up starved at this rate. Then we need more men, agreed Bracken. Can we recall those who remained at River Run? And what of Lady Mormont and Lords Derry and Forrester? They avoided the twins entirely and ended up at Greywater March with Lord Reed. They would bolster our numbers, agreed Karstark. Do we have ravens? Did they have port keys? Surely news of the twins is making its rounds. That's another thing we need to do, interjected Hermione, causing everyone to look at her. We need to start controlling the flow of information. There absolutely cannot be any rumors that Robb is dead or that we suffered a devastating defeat. We can send someone back to Riverrun, suggested Blackwood slowly, or use the parchments to convey what's happened. Take a census of who survived or their status if no one has done it yet. I think I saw Lord Serwyn trying, said Bolton. If only to keep busy, since most of his men were outside the hall when the slaughter began. He's lost most of those who came with him south. Huss is around, he survived the massacre, replied Blackwood, a touch of proud parental gleam in his eyes. And he's good with numbers. With spare rolls of parchment, he can aid Serwyn. Between the two of them, they'll have a working census of who is injured or who is missing by the end of the week. Good, said Umber. That'll give us accurate numbers and a starting place for where we stand in terms of lost command. And who is likely still at the twins? Interjected Karstark darkly. The mood soured. Then before we try retaking Winterfell, we need to free our people, said Hermione, glancing at the map on the table, at the twins and its location surrounded by the trident. An idea began to form. Bracken's mouth turned down grimly. Not the easiest feat. There's a reason why there are 2 towers. It splits forces. They'll pick us off one by one if we try an assault, agreed Blackwood thoughtfully, stroking his beard. And we hardly have the numbers for such an assault, too. Who said anything about a visible attack? Countered Hermione, a gleam in her brightly lit amber eyes. Milady? Asked Karstark slowly. Let's just say, with magic, there are far more opportunities than there are without it. She began, looking at the men in her tent, one by one, and holding their stares. Such as an attack from the water, late at night, in which we sneak in and take our revenge. A bloodthirsty grin swept across Umber's face. He barked a short laugh and he slammed a closed fist down on the table, shaking it. I'll agree to that. Kill the traitorous bastards as they sleep, one by one. Bolton, Bracken, and Blackwood all shared similar looks. One that spoke of bloodlust and vengeance. Hermione could see Eddard, just standing behind her, gripped the pommel of his sword tightly, no doubt thinking of the Frey, whose sword had caused Torrhen's fatal wound. All of them? Asked Karstark quietly, something unreadable in his face. Even the women and children? The room paused, and some of the desire for revenge slipped away. Hermione, however, thought back to the parade of women who served food at the royal table, each in equally low-cut dresses, and the way that Black Walder continued to push the marriage on Robb. She thought of the women, some pale-faced and despondent, and others with shrewd looks in their eyes as they stared hungrily at the young king. If they knew, then yes, she said quietly. Then they die too.
How would we even be able to know that?
Cried Karstark. The gods know that I would love to get my hands on the Frey who killed T. Torrhen, but what about those children who are too young to have known? Everyone would lie to save their life. Not if they ingest Veritaserum, replied Hermione coolly. We'll take the twins and kill the guards, and any other Frey soldiers we come across. Any women or children deemed as potentially unknowing of the betrayal will be sequestered elsewhere and taken into a room, one by one, where I will give them Veritaserum, a truth potion that I can brew. Then we'll know if they knew. And if they did, asked Bolton, but there was a deceptively light tone to his voice, like he already knew Hermione's answer, but wanted to hear her say it. Hermione turned to him. There was something strange in her face, something otherworldly in the sharpness to her cheeks, in the point of her chin, or the pale pallor to her skin. And for a brief moment, the men around the table realized that perhaps, just perhaps, being so connected to magic, she wasn't quite as human as them. But then the moment passed, and while her eyes still were lit by an inner light and her cheeks were flushed, she said, starkly in the coldest voice the men had ever heard her use, "Then we kill them all." Plans to attack the twins was tentatively scheduled for the next full moon, which was just over a full month away, having passed recently during the attack. It gave Hermione just enough time to begin brewing Veritaserum from her slowly depleting stores of potions ingredients, as well as her to cast the taboo. A part of Hermione was sick with the idea of using the taboo, something that had been used to actively hunt down fellow Muggleborns during the Second Blood War, but another part of her realized that it was the best option she had for keeping Robb's disappearance under wraps. A Fidelius could hide a person or location, but Robb wasn't physically there, hiding an idea behind the taboo. Something similar, if not an extreme version to an unbreakable vow, was her only option. There was no special incantation for the taboo. Like most advanced magics, it was based on intent, which made it rather woolly, in Hermione's opinion. There would be no way to know if it worked unless someone tried, and in order for someone to try, there had to be some type of consequence in attempting to break the taboo. Hermione decided that the person losing their voice would be the first condition of trying to break it, as she certainly couldn't apparate to that person's location if she were in the middle of something else to shut them up with a stupefy. The second condition would be a modified confundus similar to a Muggle repellent, which would cause that person to forget what they were trying to say about Robb's disappearance. The final condition would be a ping on Hermione's magic, in which she knew that someone was determined to break the taboo. She would then remove the memory of Robb from that person completely, most likely leaving them a drooling mess if they had several in-depth memories of their king. A determined person would probably find a way around the taboo, but for the moment, it would do. In between the numerous steps to brewing verte serum, which included 2 sleepless nights of intense time-stirring and ingredient additions, Hermione cast the taboo, with Karstark, Bolton, and Umber watching. After all, what proof did they have that her magic would work as described? She stood just outside the broken tower, which served as the largest meeting space outside her tent. The walls were moldy and snow had crept in at certain spots. It was drafty and hardly provided shelter from the elements, but they had a fire pit and it was enough for a launching point, as opposed to River Run. Although there were curious guesses cast their way, Serwyn and Hoster Blackwood kept those around them busy, working through their census of the remaining force. Those unable to fight or in need of medical attention were made note of and their portkeys recalibrated by Hermione to send to River Run. The first batch had already gone earlier that week. The day after those in her tent decided their plans, along with Bracken, who explained in person what occurred at the Twins to Edmure, Arya, and Brienne. Intent-based, the taboo was an invisible spell that flowed from her wand, pointed at the nearest person, who was Umber, twitching slightly with the point directed at him, and from there would jump and spread until it covered those not only in the north but south through the Riverlands as well, contained by their ward map. Anyone part of the Northern and Riverlands army would be affected by a friend of a friend, particularly anyone who spent time around Robb Stark or his campaign. It was an odd spell, being intent-based, trying to explain it to those closest to her in the know as difficult, but it boiled down to, well, no one in Dorne gives a hoot about Robb Stark beyond the outcome of the war, so why would they have knowledge of what happened at the Twins? Leaving the intent-based taboo to only apply to those in the know of the breaking of guest rights and the missing king. Hermione, as the magical being facilitating the spell, was able to see it and watch as the soft gray cloud lit up around Umber, who was still shifting uncomfortably, which was quite amusing given how large the man was. The spell glowed around the man briefly, like an inner aura coming to the forefront, and then sunk into him. Then tendrils reached out and encompassed Bolton and Karstark. The same happened to them, an invisible dove gray aura that pulsed once, and then sunk into their bodies, only for more tendrils to reach out to those nearest Blackwood, his son Hoster, and Serwyn. The spell continued, soft, almost insidious, as it traveled from one person to another, and then another, all unknown as they couldn't see the spell work like Hermione could. The effects of the taboo settling into their very soul. Eyeing a cluster of silver-glowing men some distance away, Hermione deliberately turned away and fought a shiver. Within hours, the spell would have caught on everyone in the Wolfswood and would begin to spread southward with anyone using the portkey or the next batch of wounded sent to River Run. By the end of the day, perhaps the week, anyone who had knowledge of the Twins, including those who planned it, maybe, would be unable to speak, write, or even think of the idea of Robb Stark missing. Those in the know absolutely would not be able to do so, and those who might have a vague idea of questioning where their king was would not speak of their doubts. And those who merely speculated would not be able to speculate on a disappearance, but rather a recovery of a wound at the worst. With a sigh, Hermione lowered her wand and let it slip back into her wrist holster. "Is it done?" questioned Umber, his voice rumbling across the ground where he stood shock still, eyes darting about for a physical clue. Hermione nodded. The tense man visibly relaxed and shook his shoulders like a bear, sloughing snow from its fur. "Good, let's continue with our plans then, shall we?" "Bring in Lord Serwyn and Hoster as well," ordered Hermione, and Blackwood, who was hovering at the edge of the group, within listening distance, nodded once, turning to holler for his son, and the other man, Lord Serwyn, to join them. By unspoken agreement, the 3 men and Hermione entered her tent first, a secure location for them to discuss the upcoming attack on the Twins. Just behind her shuffled in Blackwood, holding back the flap for Soreen and Hoster. While Hoster had seen some of her magic in action back when she helped liberate Raventry Hall, the effect of an exterior-looking tent and a log cabin interior was a bit much for the teenager. What? He turned on his heel, taking in the odd kitchen and living area, the hallway and doors open to the 2 bedrooms further down. Serwyn's mouth had dropped open first, but he quickly shut it with a snap, watching as the other men made straight to the rectangular dining table Hermione was using for their plans, falling into familiar seats that they preferred around the table. Umber groaned as he sat, while Bolton leaned over to review the map that they had spread across the wood grain. "Lord Serwyn, why don't you take a seat, please?" offered Hermione, and the man complied, silently with wide eyes. Once he did so, and everyone else was seated comfortably, she began. "What are our numbers at here? How many can fight?" If you're looking at launching a full-scale attack on the twins, began Serwyn carefully, his tones measured and cool, then we do not have nearly enough. Hermione shared a glance with Umber, Bolton, Blackwood, and Karstark, which the man caught. He frowned and glanced at Blackwood's son, a godsend with numbers and accountancy, as he was learning, potentially thinking of asking Blackwood for the team to come back with him to Castle Serwyn, who looked as confused as he. I'm not looking at launching an assault, said Hermione eventually, turning to face the man. What I need are really a handful or so of soldiers capable of fighting. Karstark frowned and crossed his arms, while Umber snorted. 2 handfuls, the large man grunted. Hermione shot him a glare and amended, fine. 2 handfuls. Capable soldiers who could listen to me and follow my orders. Ideally, the stealthiest we have. Serwyn glanced at Hoster, who nodded thoughtfully. Bolstered, Serwyn turned back to Hermione. We can find them. Excellent, she said, smiling, but it was more like baring her teeth aggressively. We'll meet with them first thing tomorrow, so if you could pick out 24, I'd be grateful, Lord Serwyn. The man glanced around the table, quickly taking stock of how the men around her deferred to her instruction, and nodded as well. Of course, my lady. Shall we go over the plan? Suggested Bolton calmly. Hermione nodded and stood, pushing her chair back as she leaned over the table. Those chosen by Serwyn will join us tomorrow for the next 2 weeks in training. Training, echoed Hoster loudly. When everyone turned to look at him, he blushed scarlet. Ah, my apologies, my lady. Blackwood scowled at his son, but Hermione smiled softly and nodded. Yes, training. I'm gonna using a bubblehead charm to help everyone with this plan, so everyone has to get a feel for the spell in breathing underwater. At Hoster's continued and growing incredulous look, Umbar quickly intervened, especially as a glance toward Hermione had her eyes beginning to narrow. 1 interruption was fine, it seemed, but not 2. Aye, lad, rumbled Umber. Lady Hermione's magic allows her to create a breathable spell around our heads. We will be swimming down the trident towards the twins, instead of launching an attack on the castle. They won't expect something to come from the water, and especially not something from under the water. Hoster's mouth dropped open. Under the water, Lord Umber? Oh, Hoster, said Hermione, with a shark-like grin on her face, one that was mirrored by everyone else at the table except Serwyn. You're about to learn how wonderful magic can be. Later that evening, as Hermione exited her tent, she spotted a lone figure at a large bonfire, sitting cross-legged on a log that soldiers had felled earlier to create seating. Several other bonfires were going in a concentric around the perimeter of the camp as a barrier from any wild creatures. Seeing the man only in profile, Hermione started as she recognized the slope of his nose, the scraggly, bushy, and untrimmed beard, and the slumped shoulders. He was playing with something in his hand, a bit of string, twine, or just even a twig. She couldn't tell. Hermione paused, hovering indecisively for a moment. Do I go or speak with Umber about the training for tomorrow morning? But then gave herself a tiny shake of the head and strode to the log. She promptly sat, startling the man, but kept her face forward, eyes on the flickering orange flames. My lady, the man greeted quietly. Hermione inclined her head. Karstark. They fell silent. Eventually, Karstark sighed and tossed what was a twig into the fire with a vicious movement. Is something bothering you? She asked quietly, glancing at him and turning her head partially towards him as well. Forgive me, my lady, he muttered. My concerns are not yours. You do not need to worry about me. Hermione felt her heart clench. She turned to face the man fully. Lord Karstark. She paused and took a deep breath. Rickard. He turned to her in surprise at his given name. Torrhen was my closest friend here, she began softly, glancing away toward the fire and then back at him. The pain of losing him so recently made her throat close and her chest ache. I miss him every day, and I only knew him for about a year. He was your son, and you knew him better and longer than I ever could. She glanced up at the starry sky, some of the lights disappearing behind ominous clouds, and rolled her lower lip into her mouth, biting down on it hard. I can't even imagine how you're feeling. Ed is still here, but Harrion is somewhere in the Westerlands as a Lannister prisoner, and we'll get him back, I promise. And I just... Her shoulders slumped, and soon she was mimicking the pose she first saw Karstark in. I feel like I've let you down, somehow, along the way. When the man didn't respond, she glanced up at him and saw that he was watching her intently. His salt and pepper hair was darker in the encroaching darkness, but the flickering fire etched much deeper lines on his fatigued face. Hermione was surprised, having not considered him that old or troubled that he had deep grooves of worry lines. But the death of his youngest son clearly impacted him far more than she initially realized. "My lady," he finally said, his voice low and warm. "Hermione, you are by no means a disappointment, nor have you let me, or any of us here, down. Without you, I fear things would have been much worse." The band around Hermione's chest eased at his words. He sighed deeply. "Perhaps it is hard for me. I have his face collapsed briefly in pain, and he cleared his throat. "Two grown sons whom I helped to raise and rear into strong northern men. Men who always did the right thing, were fearsome and true with their swords. Men who did the right thing and were loyal without fault." Stark looked at her, a small smile on his lips, partially hidden under a mustache in need of trimming. "My daughter, Alice, is a year or so younger than you. I haven't seen her since we marched south, so long ago now. I can only hope and pray to the old gods that she is well." He paused, that smile on his face, as he turned back to the fire. "But then I see you, and you remind me of her, and I know she will be well, that she is well, because you are strong and resilient and capable. Lady Hermione." Hermione felt a flush spread across her cheeks. She leaned forward to try to catch Karstark's eyes, and when she did so, she said emphatically, "Thank you, Lord Karstark." The man returned her smile, his eyes crinkling at the corner as they turned up. "Well, I suppose that is only natural that sometimes I see my daughter in you then, Lady Hermione, and I naturally want to scold or advise, depending on the situation." "Oh?" asked Hermione, leaning back slightly. He hummed in agreement. "Yes, particularly about the women and children at the Twins." Hermione fell silent. She knew that Karstark didn't necessarily approve. While he wanted revenge for what happened to Torrhen, he wanted the Frey soldier who killed him in battle, not the slaughter of women and children who didn't directly hold the sword. Although Hermione felt the familiar bubble of rage build her in chest, she schooled her features and asked coolly, "What about them?" "Your magic is quite wondrous," began the man hesitantly, sending her an imploring look. "Is there nothing that would substitute for killing them?" "Why should I do that?" she asked in response, hedging any answers. "I can humor his opinions," she thought. "There's no need to alienate anyone." "My lady," said Karstark gravely, his tone shifting quickly, "it is one thing to kill a man when you both have swords in your hands and your bloodlust is up. It is quite another to plan someone's murder and follow through with it." He stood, brushing dirt off his hands and onto his trousers, looking down at Hermione. "And if there is one thing that I've learned about you, Lady Hermione, it is that you do what is right, and not what is easy." Karstark turned on his heel and walked away, leaving Hermione staring after him until the darkness swallowed his form. A series of controlled operations had Hermione able to create 4 port keys to Greywater March. At the head of the trident, a single fork in the neck that would travel south and feed directly into a wider, wilder river at the Twins. The water was murky, a mixture of gray and brown, with green floating algae. On either side of the bank, strange, large bushes with pointed, floppy leaves grew in patches, and creeping vines scaled up large tree trunks where softly hissing reptiles, some cross between a Komodo dragon and chameleon, lazily reclined. The air was humid and smelt like rotted leaves. Hermione was inordinately pleased that they would be leaving the swampy lands of House Reed shortly. Hermione stood on a shallow, sandy bank with Eddard at her side, and Karstark, Umber, Bolton, Blackwood, his son Hoster, and a few others clustered nearby. Earlier in the day, Hermione had told them no armor, just boiled leathers, and then charmed everything black. Umber, in a jovial mood to gain some revenge on the Freys, had joked about taking the black, but Hermione wasn't quite sure she understood the reference fully, something about a wall. "Remember, breathe normally," she instructed, facing the baker's dozen amount of men in front of her. "The bubblehead charm will not fail. I'll also be casting a warming charm to keep us temperate in the water. Do not lose your sword or crossbow. Do not pull it out until we are at the Twin. Once you emerge from the water, the bubblehead charm will dissipate and you will breathe normally without it. Keep in formation, stay close, and eyes forward. Remember, our target is the left tower first, and once it is secure, we'll move to the right." There were nods of understanding around. Most had seen Hermione's magic in action by now, and they had trained specifically for the plan for several weeks. "There will likely be a sentry on watch," inputted Umber gruffly, eyeing everyone and holding their gazes. "I will lead first and take them out, and then you all will emerge second." "This is not a battle," finished Hermione, his voice grim. "This is a stealth mission. We arrive silently, unknown. We get in, and we take out the Freys one by one. Quickly and quietly. We round up any women and children into a single space. The hall is our planned location, and if need be, I can hit them with a silencio to keep us hidden. Time and precision is key." She stopped and looked around. Any questions? Silence greeted her, and Hermione nodded once herself, moving directly to Eddard as one of the two, Umber being the second, to lead the men into the water. She tapped Eddard smartly on the chest, and then the head with her wand. The first was the warming charm, and the second, the bubblehead. Eddard held his breath for several seconds, moving straight into the cold, murky water of the trident until his mouth and nose were entirely submerged. He raised a single hand and flicked two fingers in a jolly salute, and everyone breathed a heavy sigh of relief, which Hermione gamely ignored. It was one thing seeing her magic, but it was another experiencing it firsthand. She moved down the line, and soon everyone was submerged except her. She holstered her wand and non-verbally and wandlessly cast the warming charm and bubblehead on herself, striding into the water confidently. Unlike the last time she was in murky waters during the Triwizard Tournament, she would have full control. She closed her eyes just as she dipped her head under the water, barely feeling the cold from the chilled swamp. Once fully submerged, she opened her eyes, darting around and spotting the indistinct and shadowy figures of the soldiers around her. Umber was the easiest to spot as the largest, and he took control by point forward and then pushing off from the sandy waterbed, kicking up mud in a brown cloud. The others followed, Hermione somewhere in the middle. Although it was some distance, they reached the twins quickly. Aided by magic and their desire for battle, they spotted the grime-covered stones buried deep in the foundation of the bedrock and quickly arranged themselves around Umber. While they planned for this a month after the attack at the summit under guest rights, on the new moon, the moon itself was covered by dark, rolling clouds, providing them with extra cover. The water at the twins was dark, almost black, and its quick flow meant that there was constant foam. Umber was able to hover just shy of breaking the surface, directing Hermione and the others in a long line around the foundation, 2 or 3 meters from the shoreline, or a series of slick, algae-covered stone steps that led into the water. Swords had been strapped to their backs and shortened crossbows to their non-dominant forearm, of which Umber, floating and pushing against the current, unstrapped. The bolt was preloaded, protected with Hermione's magic against water damage, and carefully aimed up. Umber hovered for a moment, and then the bolt pushed through the water quickly, and a second later, Umber was moving out of the water and up, moving elegantly for a man his size as he disappeared. Hermione followed immediately, her wand in her right hand. The others did the same, but drew their swords with soft shinks against their sheaths. She felt the magic of her bubblehead charm dissipate with a soft pop. Umber had caught the sentry, who had been posted by the steps of a broken and unused dock. The bolt had gone straight through the man's chin and into his head, killing him instantly. The large man dragged the man back down into the water. Hermione waded through the water until she reached the steps, her hair thick and heavy around her head, as water sluiced off her in rivets the more she climbed. Their dark colors blended in with the middle of the night, and with few lamps or torches around the exterior of the first tower, Hermione was practically invisible. Hoping that the left tower was identical to the right, Hermione turned and crouched, tracing her wand along the thick wall until she created an arch, tall enough for Umber to duck through. The moment her wand tip touched the opposite side of the wall, the line she drew flashed orange, and the stone split down the middle, folding back to create a darkened entryway to the lower levels of the castle. Umber moved first, Bolton and Blackwood following along with 5 other soldiers in their group. Hermione went in the middle with Eddard at her back, and Holster behind him, and the rest of the selected soldiers followed to close the gap. Their steps were silent and evenly measured as they inched forward down the darkened, narrow halls, slightly crouched and ready, hugging the walls, and using the elongated shadows between hall sconces to provide cover. There was a low hum of activity and more light from the nearby kitchens, not protected by guards. Instead, the group swarmed the 2 entrances, one along the hall and the other on the opposite side with a passage leading up to the hall, and shut the doors quietly, with Hermione barricading them by melting the iron lock and hinges into molten sludge. She finished by tossing a silencio at the door, and then the other just as the occupants inside noticed and began to shout. "Keep going," she murmured her instructions and turned to continue down the hall. As it was the middle of the night, few were awake or roaming, but there were still some night guards standing by key rooms, the armory on the ground floor, as well as the widened hall that led to the inner courtyard. Those men were snuck up to from behind, and their throats slit with their steel, leaving the castle entrance defenseless. Hermione followed the Northerners and 2 Riverlanders, eyes alert and narrowed in concentration. She did not contribute to the task, as her slicing hexes, red and bright in the dark, would give away their position. Instead, she non-verbally cast silencing charms on the fallen bodies and muffled their steps as they walked, leaving a trail of bloodied bodies behind them, hallway by hallway. The group split into 2, half including Blackwood and Umber up a circular stairwell, continuing to the bedrooms, while Hermione remained with Bolton, Eddard, and Karstark and their soldiers. Bolton led the group, and with a glance at Karstark, who was staring at her, Hermione followed second. She kept her feet light as they slipped down the hall, their steps silenced by her, but muffled further by a thick carpet runner as they eased down 3 steps and ended up on an alcove balcony that overlooked a hall below. Hermione sucked in a breath. In the other tower, the alcove was where the soldiers disguised as musicians were. They were the ones who began firing their crossbow bolts and arrows down on Robb. She slowly stepped up to the balustrade and peered down. There were more lights in the hall, there was almost a cozy glow, and several Freys were sitting around the tables. There was no Dace, as Walder Frey rarely left his tower that he controlled, but his sons and grandsons schemed and plotted from the left tower. There were groups of men, some with pale hair, others with dark or long lank hair, in various stages of armor dress, and then several women, but much less so than the men. The women in the hall were miserable looking, with frowns on their faces and threadbare dresses that reminded Hermione in a way of the Weasleys, repurposing and reusing. But instead of saving money, it was because there were too many Freys, and no one wanted to spend money on them. There was one man that Hermione knew particularly, and her eye was drawn to him. Tall, with broad shoulders and long brown hair, his face was cold and jaw square as he stood with his arms crossed at one table. They often clashed at war meetings in River Run, and Hermione was looking forward to learning the man's secrets before she killed him. "Black Walder," she muttered, her voice tight. "Soon," replied Bolton in a hiss, his voice barely a breath on the wind. Beside her, Eddard retrieved his crossbow and lined it up, picking his target. Bolton on her other side had already done so, and Karstark and the other soldiers spread out along the top and had their targets as well. Hermione pointed her wand at Black Walder. A vicious smirk wanted to spread across her lips, but instead she ruthlessly pushed the emotion down. Although it was poetic irony that they would attack the Freys in the same manner they'd attacked Robb's army, Hermione could not let her emotions get the best of her. Instead, she took a deep breath, trying to calm herself down, and in her exhale, felt better. Then, stupefy, she thought. The flash of blue from the spell racing down from the balcony and slamming into Black Walder's back, knocking him forward and onto the table. There was a moment of stunned silence as the other Freys around the table stared at the large man, but then some jumped to their feet, only to have a crossbow bolt precisely target them, often through the throat or in the head, killing those men instantly. Their stealth no longer needed, Eddard and 2 other soldiers vaulted over the edge of the balustrade, Hermione behind them. While they landed heavily on their booted feet, Hermione used a wandless cushioning charm to soften her fall. Bolton and Karstark from above raced around the narrow hall towards the servants' stairs, leading down into the hall to come at the Freys from a different angle. 2 soldiers remained above to reload their crossbows. Hermione ducked under the swing of a dagger by a thin, narrow-faced Frey in a silky gray jerkin with ornate scrollwork in his leather. His thin lips scowled deeply as he recognized her, cursing "witch" under his breath. Hermione spun on her heel, and using a move Torrin had taught her, used the momentum to sweep her leg against his, knocking him down. The man was unbalanced and toppled backward, and Hermione continued the swing. Her left hand flicking out, a flash of blue erupted, and the man slumped over unconscious. Hermione blinked, but she looked down at her hands. In her right was her wand, and her left empty. Did I just wandlessly cast Stupefy out of my hand? A loud cry caught her attention, and she shook her head, quickly turning to the next threat. However, this Frey was sprawled on the floor in front of Bolton, who had his sword pointed at the man's throat. The Frey had a hand pressed tightly to his tight, around a bolt sticking out of the fleshy part of his upper leg. Blood gurgled around it, some spilling over into his hand. "Please, mercy! Mercy!" he cried. "I am Walton. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. I wasn't even there." Lord Walder called us all back to the twins. Around them, the quick battle in the hall was ending. Several men lay bloodied and dead around the tables. At some point, Bolton and Karstark had rounded any survivors to one table, and someone else had bolted the hall doors shut. Hysteria began to creep up on Hermione as the sight of blood in the familiar hall, the bolted doors the only way out, and the crossbow bolts were a painful echo and reminder of what happened just a month earlier. Cries for mercy were new, though. Hermione stepped forward, her eyes coolly sweeping the Frey Walton from the top of his brown hair to his wide, panicked eyes, and down to the wound in his leg. "Was mercy given to us when you attacked during guest rites?" she asked. The man shuddered. "It wasn't me. It wasn't. Oh, Seven, protect me." "Wasn't you?" she repeated, eyebrows raised. "Well, there's an easy way to find that out. But first," she raised her wand consciously this way, making a mental note to refer back to earlier, and cast Stupefy. The man slumped over, quiet and unconscious. She rotated slowly on her heels until she was facing the table where several bloodied and bruised Freys were slumped, some wearing mulish expressions and others utter terror. She smiled. "Who's next?" Black Walder was forcibly brought to consciousness with a splash of freezing water hitting him directly in the face and soaking through his leathers. He gasped and jerked, but didn't get very far as he was tightly bound to a single chair in a small dark room. He tossed his head to get some of the dripping water out of his eyes, and he peered around. "Who's there?" he demanded. "Show yourself." "Gladly," replied a feminine voice, and from the darkness, the curly-haired witch emerged. "Remember me, Walder?" "Witch," he hissed. She smiled, but it wasn't a nice one. There was something in her hand, a bottle of some sort, and his eyes swept back towards her. "Are you gonna poison me, witch?" "Not at all," she replied. "This?" She shook the bottle, and the clear liquid inside sloshed a bit. "This isn't poison, Walder. It's verite serum. There's a saying in my world that I think you're going to learn to appreciate. It's the truth will set you free." She paused. "But in your case, free means death, so I suppose this could be a poison if you want it to be called so." He stared at her. "I'm not drinking that." "You really have no choice," she replied evenly. Suddenly, an armored gauntlet smashed into the side of his face. Swinging his head around, Walder tasted blood, and he spat it out. Another hit turned his head to the opposite side, and pain explored by his eye. He turned back to the witch and saw one of the Wolf King's personal guards standing just behind her with two shiny gauntlets covering his hands and forearms, already splattered with blood. He eyed the material, glancing between it and the man, and realized that his black boiled leathers meant he found the gauntlets somewhere else. The witch followed his gaze. "Your own armory. Nice touch, don't you think?" He grunted. "Ready?" "It only takes 3 drops," she continued, holding up the bottle. His glare made her sigh, and she turned back to the other man. "Ed, if you don't mind." The Northerner, Eddard Karstark, he recognized him now, stepped forward, and Walder could do nothing as the tall man rained down blow after blow, each calculated to hit a spot he already hit, increasing the pain. Yes, Walder remembered. His brother was good friends with the witch, but if he's not there now... Walder stuttered out a wet laugh. "Lost something, Karstark. Where's your brother?" From behind a swollen eye. And through split lips, he gave the two a bloody grin. "Did one of my kin kill him?" The next hit went to his stomach, and Walder gasped. "Ed." Scowling, the stocky Karstark stepped back, the witch stepping forward. Walder lazily lifted his head to see her crouched in front of him, shaking her head, but her eyes were hard and her jaw was clenched. "You really don't know when to stop or keep your mouth shut, do you?" she asked, pointing her wand at his leg. "What?" "Reducto." Walder screamed. His knee, what was left of it, was on fire. With his mouth open, panting for air, he offered no resistance as someone else stepped up from behind his chair and pried his jaw open. Quickly, 3 drops of the liquid in the bottle the witch carried were dropped into his mouth with a stopper, and then a lazy, warm feeling overcame him as his pain receded. The witch's voice came from a long way off, like he was hearing her from under the water. "Now, Walder," she was saying, her voice pleasant if not steely, "let's begin, shall we? Tell me, who came up with the idea to attack us under guest rights?" The warm haze and pleasant voice had him replying instantly. He wanted to share everything. "My grandfather and brother." "That wasn't so hard, was it?"
"No."
"Wonderful." "Now, Walder," the pleasant voice continued. "However, due to the haze, He couldn't see her face, but if he had, he would have seen the vicious grin. "You're going to tell me everything?" Later, Hermione stood with Bolton, Eddard, and Karstark, staring down at a glassy-eyed Walder Frey, who had finished providing them with the list of names of those involved with the attack, as well as their reasons. Off to the side, a parchment with an enchanted quill recorded everything he said. Hermione glanced at Bolton. "I'm sorry." Bolton's jaw tightened and his eyes narrowed. "Ramsay will pay his dues." He then glanced away. "Once, maybe I would have wanted to return to a position of a Warden of the North or a king, but now—" "Shall we kill him?" interjected Eddard roughly. "He's confessed." His scowl deepened. "Thoroughly." Hermione nodded, almost absently. "Yes, and by now Lord Umber and Lord Blackwood should have roused everyone in bed and brought them to the hall." She sighed. "We're gonna have to split up to get through this quickly if we're gonna take the other tower any time before dawn." "Is there enough for us, Aram?" questioned Bolton. "Yes," replied Hermione, glancing at the bottle. "I have another 2 in my pouch with me, and it only takes 3 drops. No more." "Very well," the pale man said. Somehow Bolton and Karstark had Hermione turned and heading towards the hall as they were using a small storage room off it for questioning when behind she heard a gurgle and Eddard muttering, "For Torrhen, you piece of shit." She faltered in her step just once, but caught herself and threw over her shoulder, dumped the body in the river, and in response, "Yes, my lady," the 3 strode into the hall, which was now much more crowded. There were women holding on to children with various ages, many of the girls weeping, some were crying loudly, and others just had silent streaks down their cheeks. A few women, the older ones, wore scowls, and Hermione eyed them thoughtfully. They probably knew about the attack. The men and women were separated, held at different ends of the hall, and one by one, the soldiers with Hermione and the lords with her took the men into various side rooms to interrogate. Took several hours, even with Hermione and Umber, Karstark, Bolton, and Blackwood working separately. Hermione stood with her arms crossed, her wand tapping against her upper arm as she stared at the women and children, those who remained in the hall. A few stared back at her, boldly, but one timid-looking woman, middle-aged and worn down, plaintively asked, "What happened to my husband?" "Who's your husband?" asked Hermione. She bravely stood, despite the beautiful raven-haired woman beside her grasping onto her sleeve to pull her back down to the bench. On the woman's other side, a dark-haired boy, no more than 11 or 12, looked up in alarm. "Walton Frey," the woman said, her voice wobbling. "I am Dina Harding. We were visiting my nephew in the Vale. We only just returned a fortnight before the House Summit, my lady." When Hermione said nothing, Dina took a hesitant step forward, and then another, clasping her hands to her front. Her voice began to rise in terror. "Oh, please, my lady! My Walton could not have known. We didn't." She felt Karstark shift beside her and steeled herself not to look at him. Walton Frey knew nothing about the attack, she thought, frowning and pursing her lips. His wife is telling the truth, and so was he under Verate's Sarum, as did his grown son. So what do? He's a grown man with a son and daughter, whom Black Walder knew well, and another son. I can't just let them go. "My lady," prompted Karstark, his voice low. There was a strain, as if he was wondering if she would just say to hell with it and kill all the Freys. But Hermione sighed and let her arms drop from their cross position. "Ed, bring him in." With a scowl, Eddard silently did so, exiting the hall and shortly returning with Walton Frey, stumbling and limping with his bad leg. It had been dressed and treated, roughly, but he was alive. His wife cried out in relief and ran to him, and the two collapsed into each other's arms, Dina running her hand over his face and hair. Eventually, the woman turned to Hermione and gushed, "Thank you, my lady, thank you." Their daughter and young son raced forward and helped their father to sit on a nearby bench, unconsciously choosing to sit at a table away from the others. Hermione surveyed them and then impassively looked back at the women and children. "I am not without mercy," she began slowly, her voice carrying in the hall. "Those who participated knew something of the attack, of breaking sacred guest rights, have paid their dues, or will do so shortly. Some of you are included in that. We know your name. We know who collaborated with Walder Frey, Black Walder, and Edwin." A few women stiffened their backs, and Hermione knew she found those who helped. Some of their fellow soldiers moved through the crowd and separated those women from the group, some struggling and one even protesting loudly that they couldn't treat her that way. Others looked horrified at the idea, staring at those being singled out and shoved out of the hall for their interrogation under Verate's Sarum. Yet, those of you who did not know of the attack, she continued, drawing everyone's attention back to her, your lives. She trailed off, and a heavy, tense air settled in the room. She knew Bolton, Umber, and Ed wanted their deaths, to eradicate the Freys from Westeros for the dishonor of breaking guest rights, among other infractions. Her eyes drew towards Stark, who met her gaze. Right or easy? She mentally sighed. Your lives will be spared, she finished, and a few burst into loud sobs of relief. However, she raised her voice to be heard. That does not mean you are free to go. My lady, one asked. Hermione's cold glare softened, and she felt a heavy weight on her shoulders as she said, I can't let any of you go free, able to spread word of what we have done or how we got here. I'm sorry, but you will be confined to the twins for the foreseeable future. There was some tense muttering and shifting. Look, you've been here a while now, so how about I bring up some drinks and light food? Asked Hermione, appealing to the mothers. Any of you with husbands or brothers or sons who were not involved in the attack will join you shortly. That seemed to bolster the spirits of the Frey women, and soon those who remained spread out around the hall. The few soldiers who remained disappeared, and returned with innocent Freys, which Hermione thought was a rather strange idea. How innocent could they be with a family like theirs under Walder Frey? After a few terrified and silent servants from the kitchens that they had earlier barricaded in entered with platters of cold meats and finger foods, as well as several pitchers of wine. Thank you, my lady, said a grateful and hoarse Dina, as Hermione walked up and down the aisles between the seats, as the woman caught her hand. With her other, she took a generous sip of the wine to soothe her throat. Hermione looked at her. You really shouldn't thank me just yet. Confused, the woman stared at Hermione. At the other end of the hall, someone's goblet clattered to the ground, and the man stumbled, and then fell. Someone screamed, but it was cut off as they dropped to the floor. My lady, whispered Dina, fearful eyes on her as they fluttered shut, and she dropped the drink, spilling the red liquid on her dress and floor as she slumped forward on the table. Hermione detached herself and stepped back. You poisoned them? Asked a horrified Stark, staring open-mouthed at the hall as those remaining quickly fell to the floor or slumped somewhere. Hermione shot him a nasty look. Do you really think so low of me? If I am to kill someone, I'll look them in the eye as I do it. I'm a Gryffindor. Stark. She shook her head. Merlin, you told me to do what was right instead of easy. Easy would be killing them all. Right was not, but I also couldn't keep them here. We don't have enough people to watch them and keep an eye out for another uprising or retaliation. By the gods, uttered Umber as they returned to the hall after their interrogations. Are they dead? Hermione huffed and stamped her foot. No! For the last time, I didn't kill them. They're unconscious, said Eddard, lifting one man's arm and letting it drop heavily back onto the table with a thud. How long will it last? Until I give them the antidote, sighed Hermione. Surprised, Stark made a noise, and Hermione turned to him with tired eyes. Really? It's draft of living death, Stark. They're in an enchanted sleep, seemingly dead to the world, until I wake them up. They can be like that for months, years, at least until Robb is back and winter is over, and we've won and are in a better position. Eddard gave a long, low whistle, and Bolton eyed her with approval. Hermione shook her head, her drying curls bushier than ever. Come on, we still have the other tower to do. At least we know who we are looking for, and can kill them right away. We'll herd everyone else into the hall, and do this again. And Frey? Asked Bolton coolly. Lord Walder, that is. Who will have the honor of killing him? Leave him to me, ordered Hermione. The men around her shared looks, and then Umber sighed. Well, best be back off to the water. I don't fancy walking across the bridge and getting peppered with arrows. Hermione recast warming charms, and soon they were retracing their steps down the halls, and towards the lower floor and hole in the wall Hermione had created, with experience now under them. The taking of the right tower of the twins went smoothly, from start to finish. Hermione, however, joined Umber and Bolton to the bedrooms, while Stark, Eddard, and Blackwood went to the hall. There was something terrifying as Hermione helped, kicked open the bedroom doors and either stunned the men or silenced the women with her magic on her end and theirs. Everything was quick, almost disjointed as they repeated, kick the door, enter, stun any men or kill them, and then silence and bind the women and children, exit and repeat. Eventually, they reached Walder Frey's bedroom, Umber pulled back his boot and slammed it heavily into the door, crashing it open and sending it flying in, hard enough it bounced off the wall on the other side. "What?" the man on the bed asked stupidly, sitting up and fumbling for something on his side table. Bolton and Umber both dashed forward, but Hermione saw the glint of metal and thought Expelliarmus, her hand extended, and the knife went flying, embedding itself in a far dresser. "Who?" demanded Frey, his legs tangled in his sheets. "Lord Frey," rumbled Umber. In the pre-dawn light of the room, Hermione could see the man's eyes widen. They darted from Umber to Bolton, both who stood on either side of the large poster bed, to Hermione at the foot. You started, struggling to find his voice and dignity amongst the silk sheets. "You won't get away with this." "Haven't we already?" asked Hermione idly, her grip tightening on her wand. "We're here to be your judge, jury, and executioner, Frey." Bolton glanced at Hermione, and then across to Umber, who met his eyes. "My lady," began Umber, barely taking his eyes off Frey to address her. "It's time for you to step outside." Hermione almost dropped her wand in shock. "What?" "His Grace would not want you to murder in cold blood like this," continued the man.
Frey cackled. "That's right, the wolf pup. What has become of the so-called king? Where is he to take revenge for what I and my own had the strength to do?"
"You shut your mouth," snapped Hermione, her wand pointed at the man. "Silencio." Despite being silenced, the man continued to shake with mirth, a cruel edge to his eyes as he surveyed the three in his room. "My lady," tried Bolton, turning to face her, "this is not meant for you." Hermione looked back and forth between the two men, both who met her eyes. She turned back to Frey, who smirked. Even her thoughts were disjointed as she tried to come to terms with what the two Northerners wanted her to do. Leave and not witness Frey's death. "I'm not some fragile girl." Something must have been on her face because Umber sighed. "Please, Lady Hermione. Not this. Not like this." Anger churned in her gut, but she sharply dipped her head and strode out of the room, slamming the door behind her with her magic. Moments later, Bolton opened the door. Umber had back to them, wiping his bloody blade on the once pristine sheets of Frey's bed. He glanced up and said firmly, "It's done." Grinding her teeth, Hermione snapped, "Fine." Together they headed down to the hall where Karstark, Eddard, and Blackwood had already begun weeding out those named by other Freys during interrogation, taking them to side rooms to dispose of quietly. There were fewer women in this castle, but the ones who were there seemed rather composed, if not resigned to their eventual fate, sitting quietly at various tables throughout the hall. One fairly pretty and familiar kept moving from table to table to ensure that the youngest children were soothed and quiet. Hermione watched her curiously for several minutes. There were certain women that young girl ignored, clearly marking them out to Hermione and the men with her. "I wonder if she knows what's going on," she thought, and once the girl looked up at her, Hermione waved her over. The brown-haired woman frowned, but cast her eyes down and walked towards Hermione. "My lady." "What's your name?" asked Hermione. "Rosalind," the girl replied, glancing up. Hermione nodded and then pointed to the far table nearest to Frey's dais. "Rosalind, why are you ignoring those women?" Rosalind turned to look and made a face. "My lady, you are looking for—" She swallowed thickly and her eyes dropped again. "For those who aided the attack on the king." "Yes," said Hermione, narrowing her eyes. "Those women knew of it and helped," said Rosalind, "if not in action or deed, through ensuring that his Grace's eyes were on the girls and not on the men." Hermione scowled as she suddenly realized why Rosalind seemed familiar. She was in a different colored dress, but she was one of the many girls paraded in front of Robb during the summit dinner. Clearly Frey had hoped his prettier daughters and granddaughters might have caught the king's eyes. "And what about you?" she asked, voice cool. If she had time to examine her sudden jealousy, she might have likened it to Ron's first starstruck meeting of Fleur. Rosalind's face went pale. "My lady, I did not know—" "You might not have known what was going to happen," interjected Hermione coolly, "but you must have known what your family was trying to do with having you and the others serve the meal." The Frey girl flushed, her shoulders tensing. "Would you?" she whispered, daring to look up at Hermione as she found courage. "Would you not do anything and everything to escape this place?" "Merlin, I wish I knew occlumency and legilimency right now," she thought moodily, staring at the other girl who was of a similar height to her, if only to know how truthful she is. Hermione glanced around the dour hall at the scowling faces of the older women, one even the late Frey's wife, and remembered the pinched look of Edwin Frey in the other tower and Blackwalder's cruel remarks. She tried to imagine what it would be like growing up in such a place. She sighed and then eyed the girl. You need to prove it. Take a sip of a truth potion. Would you do that? Rosalind nodded emphatically. Yes, anything. Fine, grumbled Hermione, scooping out a severely diminished bottle of verite serum. Stick out your tongue. The other girl did so easily, and Hermione dropped 3 drops of the liquid on her tongue, waited a moment, and snippily asked, "What is your name?" Rosalind Frey, came the even reply. Did you have any knowledge or suspect of the breaking of guest rights during the summit between Lord Walder Frey and Robb Stark? No. What did you think was going to happen during the summit? That perhaps His Grace would take notice of me and take me away from here. Hermione made a face. Yeah, that wasn't going to happen, she muttered under her breath. How do you feel about the attack and breaking of guest rights? Terrible, was the monotone reply. It was poorly done of my father and kin. It was wrong. It will anger the gods. It bloody angered me, muttered Hermione, who then sighed. What did you do following the attack? I was confined to my bedchambers on my brother's orders. I wanted to escape to find Olivar. Olivar, my brother. He is His Grace's squire. Hermione's eyes went wide, and she thought of the young man under guard back at the broken tower in the Wolf's Wood. They had not yet decided what to do with him. If you could go back in time, began Hermione carefully, to the moments before the attack, what do you think you would do? Rosalind was silent, not answering immediately, but then slowly she answered, under the haze of the potion, I would have tried to get word to His Grace, or perhaps the others in the northern camp. It was wrong. I would have tried to tell the witch, or ensure Olivar knew to set the wolf free. You would have tried to stop it? Hermione asked, knowing that Veritaserum could be tricky with what-ifs and could-have-beens. Yes, breathed Rosalind, and Hermione quickly gave her the antidote. Once the haze was gone from Rosalind's eyes, Hermione said shortly, I don't like you. I won't lie about that. Your brother is alive and back at our camp. Relief spread across the woman's face. However, it quickly drained when she saw Hermione's unmoved one. But I can't let you leave the twins, said Hermione quietly. You won't kill us? Rosalind confirmed, her voice wobbling a bit. Hermione shook her head, no. But you'll be under an enchanted sleep, safe, but unable to wake until I allow it with an antidote. Will there be pain, hunger? Asked Rosalind after a few moments of silence. No. Rosalind looked around the hall, her gaze settling on the youngest children, some barely more than toddlers. Will they suffer? You'd be as safe as anything, replied Hermione quietly, following the girl's brown eyes. I'll ward the doors myself, so that no one could come in and kill or rape. You'd be untouched and safe. We don't have the people to watch over in case anyone gets the idea for revenge. It would continue the cycle. I understand. The woman then straightened her back and turned to Hermione, determination in her eyes. What do you need from me? An hour later, as the light from a new day broke across the quiet forest surrounding the twins, Hermione finished the wards that contained those peacefully sleeping under the draft of living death in the Hall of the Twins. The wards included repellent charms and notice-me-nots, effectively hiding the twins in plain sight. Determined people would attempt to break the spells, but sealing the doors to the hall and effectively turning it into a tomb was another safety measure. The air was breathable and refreshed through vents, and things might get dusty, but the people would be safe. The final task was to venture to the dungeons and free those who were imprisoned during the attack. Hermione followed the men, Karstark and Blackwood electing to remain in the courtyard in case there were any Frey stragglers. The further down they went, the more humid and wet the dungeons became. The gray stone along the walls constantly wet with dripping water from the river above them. I feel like I'm in the Slytherin common room, muttered Hermione. What? Asked Eddard, staring at her. Nothing, she replied, sighing, and holding her wand up higher to light the way with her lumos. Are we there yet? Nearly, replied Umber from the head of the group. Then, Father, is that you? They turned a corner and there were cries of relief. Umber rushed to one cell where his son, the small John, rose shakily to his feet, reaching for his father through the grating. Around them, Hermione could see several highborn prisoners, some she recognized and knew well. Lady Hermione, called one, and she turned to see Patrick Mallister grinning at her from beneath a very bushy, dark brown beard. His hair was longer than she remembered it, hanging straight down to his shoulders, but he had it pushed off his forehead. Stand back, she said, tapping smartly on the lock and releasing it with a nonverbal Alohomora. The lock clicked, and the cell door swung open on loud, rusty hinges. Behind him, Lucas blinked at her act and glanced around. Is my father here? He asked, hopefully, stepping forward. Hermione pointed her wand at the ceiling. Upstairs in the courtyard, keeping watch. The Trek frowned, the motion pulling at his beard. What about the Freys? Hermione stared at him for a long moment, and then said, not a problem. Lucas and Petrick shared a glance, but said nothing. Are either of you hurt? Asked Hermione instead, looking them up and down for obvious injuries. They both shook their heads. Good, then let's go. We're getting out of here. She led them up the stairs, with several others, including a jovial Wendell Manderley, who spoke about the meal he would eat once they were free. It wasn't until they were all standing in the courtyard, Hermione looking around them, that she realized something very important. Those they led out of the cells were all male. Where's Lady Stark? She called loudly, and the conversations around her dropped. Where's Daisy? A long-faced, tanned man with hollow cheeks stepped forward. Are they not with you, my lady? Hermione slowly shook her head, turning to stare at those who came with her. Horror reflected on their faces the same emotion she felt, and with a sinking feeling, she asked, Then where is Catelyn Stark and Daisy Mormont?